Hurts brought the Sooners back from a 28-3 deficit. That's a deficit that resonates, Chris, in this region because the Atlanta Falcons, as we know, in a particular Super Bowl, wasn't able to quite hang on to a 25-point lead.
Yeah, it's funny, actually. Alex Grinch, Oklahoma's defensive coordinator, showed Oklahoma some of that game during the week prior to the Baylor game, so maybe they were just inspired to go down by as much as possible to kind of pull a New England Patriots by the end of the day. But it was an incredible comeback. I've never seen anything quite like it live.
Yeah, it was fun following you on social media on the Twitter Saturday night because your firsthand accounts were one of a kind, no doubt about it. And I guess what did that do for Oklahoma in the big picture scheme of things with this latest college football playoff rankings release on Tuesday night? I know you cover that for us there at 247sports.com. Did it really provide the Sooners with much juice in the rankings, or is there still some work to do for that team?
I think there's definitely still some work to do. When you beat the number 13 team in the country, a team that's undefeated on the road, you would think you would get a little bit of a boost from that. But Oklahoma only jumped up one spot after Minnesota lost. And they're still sitting behind a pair of Pac-12 teams that will play each other at season's end and aren't likely to lose anytime soon. I kind of thought Oklahoma's schedule would push it past those two Pac-12 teams. Oklahoma already has a pair of top 25 wins. Oregon and Utah have one combined, and that's USC, which I think is kind of a questionable top 25 team given what we've seen. And Oklahoma's strength of schedule is more difficult, but the committee's obviously seen something in Oklahoma that they're concerned with, and even with a pair of top 25 opportunities ahead of Oklahoma, I think they're going to have a really tough time jumping into that top four, barring a little bit of chaos.
Alabama still sitting there at 5 in the latest college football playoff rankings, Chris, but watching the television show, just a resounding belief there that Alabama, despite looking as if it's in pretty good position with LSU and Georgia still to play each other, we expect in the SEC championship game, a real sort of, overall thought that, Alabama is going to end up on the outside looking in at this thing for the first time in the 6-year existence of the CFP. What's Alabama's biggest issue right now in getting to that Final Four? I know Georgia's a part of that, but when you talk about the Pac-12 and OU, and its rearview mirror, who should Alabama be most concerned about?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue for Alabama is simply the lack of a conference championship game. They won't have that 13th data point, as I think the Big 12 learned of that phrase really well in 2014. But that hasn't necessarily stopped Alabama before. I think a lot of the talk surrounding Alabama has more to do with Tua's injury than it does actual Alabama's situation. I'm firmly of the belief if a banged-up Alabama goes to Auburn and puts it on Auburn, kind of like Ohio State did in 2014 with Cardale Jones as their starting quarterback, taking over for J.T. Barrett against Wisconsin in the Big Ten title game. Alabama is going to make a pretty strong statement in the committee's eyes that even without Tua, they are a top four-worthy team. And the committee, by placing Alabama 5, is still clearly indicating, at least to this point, Alabama's played like one of the 5 best teams in the country. But I do think the lack of a conference championship game, specifically in the Pac-12's case, where it looks like the number 6 and number 7 team in the country are going to face off in Santa Clara with one loss, is going to hurt Alabama. I think Alabama's going to have to be really, really dominant against Auburn and hope that Oregon and Utah either stumble or don't look particularly great against each other, kind of in the committee's eyes, for them to get in. So I would say that conference championship game is the biggest thing holding Alabama back right now.
Chris, it seems like so much of the talk is about Oregon right now. And with that, why is it that I'm sort of anticipating Utah maybe even easily handling Oregon in a conference championship game? What do you see a lot of separation between those two teams right now, Oregon and Utah? I know they're only separated by a spot in the polls, but again, much of what we hear about is Oregon, not so much Utah.
I mean, I actually, personally, in my rankings, I would have Utah spot ahead of Oregon right now. I think Utah's been more consistent recently, and I think offensively, which is kind of surprising given how much we hear about Justin Herbert, I think Utah's been more explosive and more consistent on that side of the ball. Oregon's been I've seen Oregon play a couple of times this season, and they just go through bouts of inconsistency and stretches where they just don't move the ball the way you kind of expect them to, given the amount of talent that's on that offense. They just had another injury at wide receiver, Micah Pittman, star freshman, who's likely out for a while. And I don't know. There's just something about Oregon, and maybe you share the same thoughts, that they just don't look like what we would kind of expect. I think a lot of people assume Oregon, kind of just looking at the scores. Like, I think they'll look at the score of that USC game, see that Oregon blew out USC. But even then, if you watched, USC controlled that game for the large majority of the first half. They just imploded, which I think is more a reflection on Clay Helton and kind of that staff than anything. But, like, that was a close game, and Oregon's been in a couple of those games this year where you're just not expecting it. Utah has just kind of put it on people since Zach Moss came back, their star running back, and has been healthy. So I'm kind of the opinion with you that I would favor Utah slightly in that game, but I just think it comes down to talent. People look at Oregon, see the name on the jersey, see the recruits that Oregon's brought in, kind of assume that they're going to beat Utah. But I do think I would favor Utah slightly if that game came down to today in Santa Clara.
I'm with you. I think Utah, as you said, the explosiveness, but specifically running back Zach Moss, if he's good to go, when he's been good to go for Utah, good luck dealing with them. I think he was hurt in the loss to USC as well. And USC has historically had a ton of success against Utah in the LA Coliseum. But I think Utah-Oregon could give you a semi look at what would happen if Alabama and Oregon played, because I think there's some similarities between what Utah can do offensively, maybe more so in the run game with Moss. But as far as being able to kind of have its way with the Ducks offensively, what about Oregon this Saturday night at Arizona State? Does that game kind of pique your interest as one to keep an eye on, an upset alert type game, maybe, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's largely dependent on Arizona State. If this was Arizona State in September, I would certainly be on upset alert. But I think the Sun Devils have lost 5 in a row. The defense is starting to show a few cracks. Jaden Daniels hasn't necessarily come on late in the season the way I kind of expected him to. A couple other true freshman quarterbacks have gotten much better as the season's gone along. Jaden's been steady, but he hasn't really emerged as a star. But Arizona State does have a couple of really standout players. I cannot pronounce his name, and I'm not going to try. But their wide receiver 1 is a first or second round pick next year in the NFL draft. He's a freak. Benjamin, when that run game is right, and the offensive line has been so-so, but when it's going, he's capable of putting up some big numbers. And defensively, they've shown to be really solid all year, at least especially in the first half of the season. So if Arizona State's right, that is a potential upset. But I wouldn't anticipate anything crazy happening on Saturday, but it is Pac-12 after dark, so you never know, I suppose.
Yeah, why don't I trust Mario Cristobal in this spot? Is it because I've seen Oregon, pardon the pun, lay some eggs in these type of situations? I mean, this is a team a year ago anyway, a totally different team. I get that. Lost by nearly 30 in Tucson. So maybe that has something to do with my trust issues. Chris, let's talk about Tua Tagovailoa and what might be next. If you're Tua Tagovailoa and the options that are available to you moving forward are on the table, whether it's come back to Alabama, whether it's even a pie in the sky shot at maybe taking a red shirt next year, maybe it's just go ahead and move on to the National Football League. You're quarterbacking Team Tua today. What's the next move for Tua Tagovailoa?
I guess that I know he has an injury insurance policy. I'm not sure of the exact details on that. I don't know how much it's worth. But returning to Alabama, essentially, it doesn't void that policy. Like, if he has an injury and he's drafted, let's say he wants to go in the 2021 draft instead and he's drafted later, that still harms that he can still collect on that policy, but it wouldn't probably be worth as much as it is this year based on where he's drafted. I still think the right move is declaring for the NFL draft. rehabbing in a professional clinic. I realize Alabama's team doctors are among the best in sports. I've seen the way people come back at that program and do so quickly. But at the same time, if Tua leaves school, he can focus on rehabbing 100% of the time. He can just attack football 100% of the time. And if I'm him, and he's had 4 surgeries in the last 2 years. I realize one was on a finger, but like that's a lot. If you come back, and even if you just rehab, like you're not going to be able to answer any more questions about kind of your football abilities next season, most likely, because he's likely not going to play for much of next year, if at all. So if I'm him, I look at the draft. Quarterbacks, as we've seen, even when there are big concerns, end up going in the top 10 or top 15. He might not go number 1 overall like he did, but I'm pretty sure somebody's going to jump up in the top 15 just to have a chance at somebody with Tua's ceiling. So if I was him, I would leave. If anything, this might help him later on because he'll end up at an NFL team better situated to kind of work around him with more pieces around him. We've seen over the years that some quarterbacks just get in situations and get on teams where they're just essentially overwhelmed because they have no protection, because they don't have the pieces around them to succeed. I think Josh Rosen's a perfect example of that. He's been in 2 terrible situations in the NFL, and I feel like people have kind of forgotten about him, and it's likely cost him millions. If he ended up in a better situation, you never know. And I think at the end of the day, Tua's going to get healthy, and he'll get drafted a little later, but that might end up being a blessing in disguise ultimately.
It could. It very well could. And as for the insurance aspect of this, doing some research on that, most of those coverages typically fall between $1 million and $10 million at the high end, although they can go upwards, I guess, of 60% of a guy's projected rookie contract. And thinking where Tua was projected here before last Saturday, I would think that would take him more up along the lines of 8 figures than more along the lines of 7. But yeah, it'll be fascinating to watch play out, no doubt about it. Best all-around team in college football today who is that, Chris Hummer?
Ohio State, but I think Clemson is quietly climbing to take that spot. But Ohio State's been the most consistently dominant team in the sport. Top 3 offense, top 3 defense, dudes all over the field. There's legitimately probably 11 NFL draft picks on that defense. And the offense isn't far behind in that regard. So I lean Ohio State, but I think we're all kind of forgetting about Clemson a little bit as the season goes along. And the battle for number 1 between LSU and Ohio State is super critical because you do not want to play Clemson in the semifinal. You want to take kind of a beat-up Alabama or somebody from the Pac-12 or somebody from the Big 12. You do not want to see Clemson in the semifinal.
Yeah, this has almost come full circle for me with Clemson. I'm almost to the point of having to defend Clemson, it feels like. Just because the league is atrocious, that's always been understood. When it comes to the ACC, this is still a really good Clemson team, man. You know, it's elite, and I understand that. You know, you look at some of the numbers, and you have to sort of project what they might or might not be if they weren't in the league that they're in. But you know, we talk about the eye test so much, and when you look at Clemson, you see everything you need to see, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think people forget, like, Dabo Swinney, like, is not one of those coaches who tends to just, like, put it on teams. Trevor Lawrence hasn't played more than about 2.5 quarters in about a month and a half. So, like, the scores that you see, Clemson winning by 40, Clemson winning by 50, are essentially their backups doing a lot of that work at the back end of the game. And honestly, like, we watched the playoffs last year, right? Like, the committee saw the playoffs. I know they can't take that into account. I know this season's this season, but we saw what Clemson can do to elite competition, and we saw what Clemson could do to Alabama, which I was in the conversation last year at that time as the greatest team in history. And we saw Clemson just, I don't want to say destroy. I think that game was closer than a lot of people thought, at least when you kind of look at how it developed. But Clemson won that game pretty handedly. And I have no reason to think, kind of given what's on that roster still, that Clemson's not capable of going into the playoffs and holding more than holding its own.
I don't know if you know this or not, Chris Hummer, but you walked into a party here on Southern Fried Sports today. We are celebrating the 8-year anniversary of a chaotic weekend in college football that, in my opinion, maybe yours too, went a long way in the formation of the college football playoff. 8 years ago this weekend, Chris, Iowa State knocks off Oklahoma State. USC and Lane Kiffin goes into Eugene and knocks off Chip Kelly and fourth-ranked Oregon. And lo and behold, we are on a collision course for that rematch between LSU and Alabama in the BCS championship game. What do you recall about that weekend, Chris?
Well, I remember the Oklahoma State side pretty well, given where I live in the country. That was a difficult week for Oklahoma State as a whole. They went through a bit of tragedy on that campus. A plane carrying one of their sports teams crashed, and they lost a couple people. And then Ames, Iowa's always been a really tough place to play, but I remember watching that game and thinking there's no way Oklahoma State's going to lose. That was an Oklahoma State team with Justin Blackman, one of the best receivers in college football history, in my opinion.
Whedon at quarterback? Yeah.
Yep. Brandon Whedon at quarterback, first-round pick, and that offense was not – nobody had stopped or slowed down that offense all year, and they went to Ames, Iowa, a place that wasn't coached by Matt Campbell at that time, a place that hadn't seen a victory of that nature in decades, and they lost. And I think Mike Gundy's career trajectory changes a lot. Had that game been won, I think Les Miles potentially might even be at LSU still had that game been won by Oklahoma State, because I don't really think Oklahoma State would have matched up well with LSU. Nick Saban would have won fewer national championship, most likely, if Oklahoma State wins that game. The dominoes, as you said, the dominoes that come from that weekend are pretty incredible. And, just don't go to Ames on a Thursday night, basically, is what I'm thinking.
That was Paul Rhodes coached Iowa State, I believe, back then.
It was, yeah.
Before Matt Campbell. And something I talked about earlier in the show in relation to that weekend and that finish of the season, to think about it now, Arkansas in 2011 finished fifth in the final poll at 11-2. And its only losses that season were the two teams that played in the national championship game. How far has Arkansas fallen in 8 years?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to a former Arkansas player for a story about 2 weeks ago, and he was insisting that Arkansas is not a job that you can't win at. And he was pointing out that Arkansas was competing in the SEC championship game every 3 or 4 years under Houston Nutt and at the end of Bobby Petrino's era. I didn't believe him, but if you kind of go and look through, I know Arkansas didn't win any of those, but they were in position to at least challenge for an SEC championship. That team with Darren McFadden and Felix Jones obviously came very close to upsetting a Florida team that went on to win a national championship, an SEC championship. So yeah, it wasn't that long ago that program was winning. I'm still of the opinion that job is very difficult given the division they're in and the coaches that are in that division. But when that thing is right, you can win at Arkansas, and it is pretty insane to see how quickly that program has fallen. And obviously it starts with Bobby Petrino falling off a bike and kind of just went from there.
Oh, that chopper ride, that fateful chopper ride for Easy Rider. Hey, Chris, speaking of Arkansas and sort of as an extension of that, perhaps Gus Malzahn, the next coach, Chad Morris, obviously out at Arkansas. If there's more movement in the SEC at the head coaching position in the coming weeks, who are your most likely candidates where that'll take place? Is it South Carolina? Is it Missouri? Is it Mississippi State, perhaps? We've heard votes of confidence publicly for guys like Derek Mason. I guess Matt Luke of Ole Miss qualifies there too. What places do you have maybe on your radar where there could be some movement?
I don't think you're going to see anything in Vanderbilt and Ole Miss. I believe in both cases we've got statements of confidence, and also behind the scenes I think the buyouts are a little too high. South Carolina is certainly one to watch. I really don't know what to make of that situation. I've never seen a PR disaster quite like I have there. The president, the AD, essentially talking out of both sides of their mouth publicly for the last 2 weeks.
Why doesn't the school president just take gasoline and a match to Will's recruiting class at this point? Just go ahead and set the whole thing ablaze if you're that school president. You can't shut up, Chris.
Yeah, it's amazing. If I'm Justin Birch, and like obviously for those listening, I'm sure a lot of people in your audience do know who that is, number 2 overall prospects in the country. Why would you stay home if you see what Will Muschamp is going through the last couple of weeks? There's no way. I mean, it's making it impossible. It's a lot like the situation with the other USC, where Clay Helton's still alive for a Pac-12 title berth potentially. And like people have been talking about him like leaving for the last like 9 months.
Past tense.
It's kind of incredible.
Past tense. Yeah.
Yeah, like he's done. Like I've seen multiple articles about who should be the next coach. Anyway, but yeah, South Carolina is certainly one to watch. I think Auburn is always one to watch. I don't anticipate anything happening there. That buyout is still insanely high, but we know how Auburn boosters can be, and there was a big movement behind the scenes last year to pay Gus that buyout and be on his way. And with Arkansas open again, that would be a friendly landing spot for Gus if he wanted to go to greener pastures. I don't actually think Arkansas is greener pastures, but it would be a friendly spot. But yeah, I think Auburn and South Carolina are probably the main 2 to watch. If I was a betting man, I wouldn't anticipate either one of those jobs coming open this offseason, but it's SEC football, and you kind of never know this time of year what some really rich people are going to want to do. So it'll be interesting to follow.
Well, for Auburn, it comes down to the Iron Bowl. If Gus beats Alabama, he'll be 3-4. If Gus beats Alabama in 2 Saturdays, he'll be 3-4 in 7 meetings with Nick Saban. And a 9-3 season, you beat Alabama, you consider the math, the economics with a buyout. Yeah, I think Gus is fine as long as that happens. But if it doesn't, we'll see. Hey, Chris, as always, great stuff with us here on Southern Fried Sports. Always appreciate the time. Be sure to check out Chris's great work there at 247sports.com. If you haven't already, give Chris a follow on Twitter at Chris_Hummer, HUMMER. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.